This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
Late last year, thousands of New Zealanders protested against a bill that would see the Treaty of Waitangi, a founding agreement signed by Maori and the British, reinterpreted. Large protests are expected again today on Waitangi Day. So in this Squiz Shortcut, we'll get you across the history of the treaty and why the bill has Kiwis so divided. Squiz Shortcuts is your backstory to the big news stories. I'm Alice Dempster.
And I'm Andrew Williams.
Andrew, Waitangi Day is a big deal for our Kiwi friends. It's a national public holiday to celebrate the date that the Waitangi Treaty was signed back in 1840. If you're wondering where the name comes from, Waitangi is a place on New Zealand's North Island on the Waitangi River, and it's where the treaty was signed.
Yeah, I was also wondering what it meant. And according to my research, it means noisy or weeping waters. So there's a fact for you to take home with you. And Waitangi Day, as you say, is the national day, a bit like Australia Day here. There are parties, citizenship ceremonies and awards given out, that sort of thing. But also like Australia Day, it's often been an occasion for protests. And those protests are likely to get global headlines this year after the controversy that's been bubbling away in New Zealand ever since the Treaty of Waitangi made international headlines last November.
Yeah, so that was when thousands of people joined a 9-day hikoi. If you're not familiar, that's the Maori word for a peaceful march. It started at the tip of the North Island and ended in the capital city of Wellington. As I said, 9 days. It's a big walk.
Yeah, I remember looking it up when we covered the story at the time. It's about 1,000 kilometres, so it's like walking from Sydney to Melbourne and then doing another 300 kilometres on top of that. And by the time it ended, 42,000 people were crowded into Parliament Square, which is in Wellington.
Yeah, the pictures were incredible from that. It was one of the largest protests in New Zealand's history. And what they were protesting about is a bill that wants to put some clarity and definition around the Treaty of Waitangi terms. It's hugely important to them.
That's because it's seen as their founding document. It was a treaty made between 540 Maori chiefs and the British, which would give Maori the same rights as British citizens. It's a major part of New Zealand's modern history, and it plays a huge role in their policy decisions. It's also enshrined into their laws, and it's woven through their education system as well.
And Andrew, because of all that, the treaty is often held up by the international community as a model for how to address and manage Indigenous rights. We saw it being referred to a lot during our own voice referendum, but it turns out issues have come up due to the wording.
Yeah, they have, and it's because there are two versions of the Treaty of Waitangi, or there were. So one was written in English and the other one was written in Maori, and they differ on a crucial point. So basically, at a very basic level, the English version says Maori chiefs gave up sovereignty to the British, so basically full control of the country and lands. But the Maori version says they ceded governance, which is quite a different thing to sovereignty.
Right, so that means they gave authority to the British to run things, but they kept their independence and ownership of the land.
And by the mid-20th century, the whole thing had turned a bit sour. So the government was found to have breached both versions of the treaty. Maori culture and language had dwindled. A lot of tribal land had been confiscated, and Maori people were commonly referred to as disadvantaged.
So to try and change things, a special judicial body was set up in the 1970s. It was called the Waitangi Tribunal.
There's been billions of dollars in settlements since then, particularly over the use of Maori land and natural resources. And nowadays, Maori are consulted in new developments and major policy decisions. But some New Zealanders say there's been an overcorrection, and that particular swell of support amongst those New Zealanders has led up to this new bill, which has caused all these protests.
Up next, we'll take a look at what's being proposed and what the reaction has been. Andrew, the New Zealand National Party, that's led by the former boss of Air New Zealand, Christopher Luxon, won power last October after 6 years of Labor government in New Zealand. But they didn't win outright. They had to form a coalition with two other minor parties, the ACT Party and New Zealand First.
And ACT, which, if you're curious, comes from the Association of Consumers and Taxpayers, which was sort of a forerunner group, is the key one to note here, because one of the conditions of ACT joining that coalition was that they could introduce a new piece of legislation to Parliament, which was called the Treaty Principles Bill, which attempted to address and clarify the inconsistencies between the English and Maori versions of the Treaty of Waitangi.
And it's important to point out that neither the Nationals nor New Zealand First support this bill as it stands.
No, they agreed to vote for it only to get it past a first reading in Parliament, and then it would go before a committee for review. And that's where it's at as we speak. But it was that initial introduction of the bill to Parliament that coincided with the huge protest that happened in November.
And it's fair to say the headlines generated from that protest caught the world's attention, along with the haka that 2 MPs performed in Parliament. That's, of course, the ceremonial Maori dance to signify pride, unity and survival. If you've ever watched a game of rugby with Kiwis playing, you'll have seen them perform it before kick-off.
Yep, seen plenty of those in my time watching rugby. It's always a compelling start to a rugby game, that's for sure. And I guess another name to know here is the leader of ACT. So that's a guy called David Seymour. He actually has Maori heritage himself. He's driving a lot of this controversy. He wants to hold a referendum for the New Zealand people to decide what the treaty actually means and then apply that equally to all New Zealanders, not just Maori.
Yeah, he does, but critics of the bill say that it risks undoing decades of policies aimed at fixing disparities that Maori people are still facing in things like health, education and housing. So taking away those policies seems like a step backwards for a lot of people.
Yeah, and others worry that a referendum on the treaty could stir up racial tensions within the country as well.
So all that to say, the bill has sparked a massive backlash from the New Zealand Labor opposition, Maori leaders, former prime ministers from both sides of politics, and thousands of voters. And it's only cleared the first hurdle.
That's right. It's now before a committee, as we said, and that's due to wrap up public hearings by the end of the month. After that, it will go back before Parliament for debate.
And because of that opposition, it's not expected to pass. But polls say that there's a lot of Kiwis who are in favour of clarifying the treaty's wording so that any confusion going forward is cleared up. So political analysts reckon if this bill fails, another version may not be far away. And
there are some constitutional law experts as well that we've been reading who say that it could spell a larger debate about whether New Zealanders actually recognise the British monarchy as colonisers at all. So there's some interesting times ahead for our neighbours across the ditch.
There certainly is. And that's our shortcut to the Waitangi Treaty. If you'd like to dive into this a little deeper, the ABC's Global Roaming did a great podcast episode on this topic with the Maori news editor at Radio New Zealand. So I'll pop a link to that in the episode notes. Thank you for listening, and remember to share this episode with your mates who want to hear the backstory to the big news stories. And don't forget, if you have an idea for a future Squiz Shortcut, we'd love to hear them, and we'd love to hear from you. Just flick it through to hello@thesquiz.com.au. Until next time.